Hello YouTube viewers, welcome to this video and I hope you're all doing good and you're all learning Kubernetes very well. And in this video I'm gonna show you how you can use ConfigMaps in your Kubernetes cluster. In all my previous videos I used my Vagrant script to bring up a brand new cluster with one master node and two worker nodes. In this case I'm gonna do a little different where I'm gonna use a cluster using micro K8s. So I've also done a video on micro K8s. If you have watched the video or if you haven't watched the video, I would recommend you to watch that video now before doing this one if you want to follow along this video. And the video title should be I think it's single node Kubernetes cluster using micro K8s. So on my host machine here, my host machine is Manjaro Linux, and I've got Ubuntu 18.04 virtual machine, and I've installed micro K8s. So basically micro K8s is it's an application that you can install using Snap Package Manager, which can be installed on any Linux machine, but I've shown you on my previous video how to do that on an Ubuntu machine. So if you've got an Ubuntu 18.04 machine, follow my previous video about how to set up micro K8s, and then you can follow along this this video. So if I do lsb release, as you can see it's Ubuntu 18.04. I've got 1 gig of memory. I think I've got 2 gig of memory for this virtual machine, and I've set up micro K8s. If I do micro K8s dot status, you can see micro K8s is running. And if I do alias kubectl, I've created an alias for kubectl because when you install and use micro K8s cluster, you would have to use micro K8s dot kubectl. So just to save some time in typing, I've created an alias for kubectl that refers to micro K8s.kubectl. So if I do kubectl cluster info, you can see my cluster kubectl get nodes. So I've got one node, Ubuntu VM01, so that's the virtual machine, and it's running the cluster on that virtual machine. Let's check the version of our cluster. Kubectl version --shart. So we are on version 1.13.1. Well, if you're following this video in the future, about a year or so, then you would get a different version of Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so just bear that in mind. And I'm going to cd into play directory, and I'm going to git clone my Kubernetes repository, which is https://github.com just me and open source /Kubernetes. So what I would normally do is cd to Kubernetes and to Vagrant provisioning, and if I do Vagrant up here, so that will set up a cluster. But now I'm using a micro K8s Kubernetes cluster, so I'm not going to do that one. And if I go one directory about, there's a directory called YAML file, and I've created few YAML files for this tutorial. ConfigMap, how to use the ConfigMap in your pod, and so on. So well, in this video let's talk about the ConfigMaps. It's very similar to Kubernetes secrets. The syntax you use for the YAML files and how you use ConfigMaps in your pod, how you consume the ConfigMaps you've created inside a pod, it's all going to be very similar to the secrets. So the video I done before this one was about the secrets, how to use secrets in Kubernetes cluster. So if you haven't watched that video, please watch that video because everything I'm going to say here and the syntax I'm using here is going to be exactly the same for the secrets. So config map, how would you use a config map in Kubernetes cluster, or why would you use a config map? So config map, you can define an environment variable, or you can define whatever you want. It's just basic config map. It's just a map of configurations that you want to use. For example, if you've got an application that uses a configuration, you can create a configuration config map in your excuse me, you can create a configuration map in your Kubernetes cluster, and you can use it inside your pod. The advantage of this is you can bake the config map inside your Docker container and you can use it, but when it comes to updating the configuration for your application, then every time you want to update it, you want to create a new image, you want to cut a new image of Docker container, and you have to redeploy your application. So if you have got config map in your cluster, then you can update the config map dynamically and it will get updated in your pod. So that's the basic advantage of using config maps. Right, so let's look at the config map. I'll show you a couple of ways how you can deploy a config map resource into your Kubernetes cluster. kubectl get config maps. I haven't got anything. kubectl get cm. Cm is short for config maps. I haven't got anything. So let's take a look at the first one. So you can either use kubectl create config map command, or you can create a YAML file. Let's take a look at a very simple YAML file. So the API version 1, and the kind of resource you're deploying into your Kubernetes cluster, which is config map. Metadata that contains just name. The name I'm going to give for this config map is demo-config map, and I've only defined two key value pairs: channel.name, my channel name, which is just me and open source; channel owner, obviously myself, Venkat Nagapan. Okay, so that's the very simple basic config map. That's an YAML file. Let's see how to deploy that. kubectl create -f and that YAML file. So that's created. kubectl get config maps. That is that config map. And you can see under the data column there is two items defined. If you want to take a look, kubectl describe config map demo config map. You can see we've got two items here, channel.name and channel.owner. And if you want to look at the YAML version, YAML output of it, kubectl get config map demo config map -o YAML. So basically you've got these two items, data items. Okay, so that's one way of deploying a YAML file. Deploying a config map. You can also deploy it using the command without having to write YAML file. So for that, let me create another config map. kubectl create config map. You need to give it a name. For example, say demo config map -1 and -- from literal equals and the key value pair. So channel.name equals just me and open source, and another item -- from literal equals channel.owner equals Venkat Nagapan. Okay, that's created. kubectl get config map demo config map -1, and I'll put that to YAML. Okay, so that's basically it. It's the same config map defined using the command line instead of using the YAML file. So that's how you would create it. What you can also do is, instead of using from literals, you can also use from file, which I will show you in a minute. From file, you can define all your configurations in a file. You can write that in a file, and then you can import that file into this command to create that file. I'll show you that in a minute, but before that, let me show you how to use this config map in a pod. Okay, so I've got a YAML file for that pod, which is pod-config env.yaml. So how am I going to use this config map inside a pod? So I'm going to create this pod specification, Basically, the name I've given is busybox container. So I'm going to launch a busybox container, and I'm just going to run this sleep command, sleep for 10 minutes, so that I can log in and show you how we can consume the config map. So in here I've defined two environment variables, channel name and channel owner. And where am I getting the value from? Value from config map key reference. So the name of the config map. So we've already created the demo-config map config map, and I'm going to use the key name channel.name, and I'm going to use the same config map, and I'm going to use channel.owner key. So basically I'm pulling the key value from the config map, and I'm assigning it to an environment variable, which will then be used inside the container. Okay, let's go ahead and create this container, create this pod. kubectl get pods. I haven't got any pods yet. kubectl create -f pod config map n.yaml. So that pod is created. kubectl get pods. Pod is running. If you want to attach to a running container, you can do kubectl exec command -it for interactive. The name of the pod, we've only got one container within this pod, so we don't have to specify anything. We can just specify the pod name. But if you've got multiple containers within your pod, you need to specify which container you want to attach to. Okay, so I want to run the shell command. So I'm inside the container now, and if I do echo $channel name, you can see just me and open source. Channel owner Venkat Nagappan. It's basically an environment variable that got exposed inside this container. grep -i channel. So these are the two environment variables we created in the pod specification. Okay, so let me delete this pod. Okay, pod is deleted. kubectl get pods, no pods. Okay, so that's one way of using config map inside your container. I'll show you another way where you can mount the config map as a volume inside your container. So for that, I've got another YAML file called configmap-volume.yaml. So basically, you can see here, it's again very similar to secrets. Even in secrets, you define secret, and you can consume the secret either as environment variable or as a file when you mount it as a volume. So I'm defining a volume here, just any random name, demo, and the volume is going to come from the config map and the name of the config map, which is demo-config map. And the containers, I'm again using the same busybox container, and I'm sleeping for 10 minutes inside the container. Volume mounts, so this name should match with the name of the volume that you defined right here. And the mount path is /my-data, so I'm going to mount the volume under my data inside my container. So that's a very simple pod specification. Let's see what it does when we deploy it. kubectl create -f. Okay, pod is created. kubectl get pods. So it's creating the container and it's running. So now let's attach to the running container. kubectl exec -it for interactive, pod name and the command sh. So now we are inside the container, and let's look at, but before that I'll show you the grep. You won't find anything because we haven't exposed that as an environment variable, but we used that as a volume inside the container, which is under /my-data. So you get a file, one file per key value pair that you define in your config map. So in our demo-config map, we defined two key value pairs, channel name a value, channel owner a value. So it creates two files underneath it. So if I do cat, if I cat those files, you can see the value channel dot name. So that's there. Cat my data channel dot owner, cat my data, if I spell the channel correctly. Okay, so Venkat Nagapan, just me and open source. Fine, it's all looking great. What I'm going to do now is, so I've shown you how you can use it as an environment variable and as well as a volume. So the real benefit comes here when you want to update the existing config map and see whether it gets updated inside the container. The change might not happen immediately, but you have to wait for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, depending on when the scheduler thinks it should update the pod. But I'll show you how it's going to happen. So let's see what config maps we've got. So demo config map. Let's delete the other one just to make it simple. kubectl delete config map. Demo config map -1. Okay, so that's deleted. kubectl get config map. So okay, so let's edit this config file. You can use the kubectl edit command. Demo config map. So I'm going to change the channel name to something like I love Kubernetes. Save the file and the config map has been updated. If I do kubectl get config map demo config map, output that to YAML. You can see here the channel name is updated. Okay, I think still we have got the pod running. Yeah, let's take a look at the pod. Kubectl exec. Okay, we are inside the pod. If I do cat my data channel dot name, it's still just me and open source. Let's see whether it changes. You have to wait for a few seconds. As I said, it's still showing the old value. Just me and open source. Okay, it's still showing the old value. Okay, so there you go, it has updated. So it depends on, there's no specific time, so it depends on the load in your cluster and how often the scheduler checks the pod and so on. So I can't guarantee a specific time, but eventually your pod will get updated with the updates you do to the config map. So that's the real benefit. You don't have to when you use these configurations inside your container without using config map, so that's going to be your problem. So when you want to update your configuration, you need to update your container image. So now you're taking that apart and putting that as a sidecar, as a side component. So whenever you want, you can update it and it's going to reflect inside your container. Okay, let me delete the pod so that I can show you my next example. Okay, pod is gone. Okay, what is going to be my next example? Right, so I've got to show you how you can use a file instead of creating a YAML file. So if you take a look at my.cnf, so what I've basically done is I've created a sample MySQL configuration under MISC directory, miscellaneous directory. So it's a basic MySQL configuration. Okay, so let's create a config map out of this file. So what would you do is kubectl create config map. I'm going to give it a name called MySQL demo config -- from file. So in my previous example, I used -- from - literal. So now we are going to create, we have put all our configurations in a configuration file, and we are going to import that into Kubernetes cluster. So you got to use from file and the path to that file, my.cnf. That's created. If I do kubectl get config map mysql demo config in YAML output, you can see, but don't worry about this formatting, and it's a little different. But anyway, we've got our config map created, mysql demo config. So how would you use this config inside a pod? It's going to be very similar to what we did earlier. Either you can use it as an environment variable or as a volume. So in this case, as we are using an application configuration, the ideal use case would be to mount that as a volume. So I'll show you how you can do that, but before that I'm going to delete this config map mysql demo config, and I'm going to show you the other YAML file I've got. Now that's the pod. So that's the YAML file. So if you want to use that in a YAML file, the syntax would be, under data section, you create the name of the key. The key name is going to be my.cnf, followed by a pipe sign, and underneath that you can put whatever configuration you want. Okay, so that's the configuration file. It's all in my GitHub repository, and let me show you the part I'm going to create using this config map. It's essentially the same. I've created a volume with the name mysql config, and you need to make sure the volume you're mounting inside the container should have the same name, mysql config, and the mount path is /mydata. And here I'm using the volume from a config map. The name of the config map is mysql demo config, which we just deployed. And I want to create this configuration file inside a file in the container. So I'm going to use the path variable my.cnf for the my.cnf key. So in the config map we created, we've got only one key, which is my.cnf. If you've got multiple keys, you can mount individual keys in different files. So this is how you would do. You need to specify the items, and then what you're going to mount, the which key, and where you want to mount it. I mean, which file you want to use for mounting. And again, it's a simple busybox container that's sleeping for 10 minutes. Let's deploy this. kubectl create -f pod mysql volume. Okay, kubectl get pods. The container is getting created. kubectl get pods. Container is getting created. There should be something wrong. kubectl get pods. Now kubectl describe pod busybox. Okay, mysql config mysql demo config not found. Haha. Okay, so let me delete that. kubectl delete pod. Okay, let's not delete it, because we haven't got any config map with that name. We only got the demo config, because it deleted the mysql demo config, as I wanted to show you the YAML version of it. Okay, so let's keep the pod running. So once we create the config map, the pod should restart. Okay, kubectl create -f. Okay, that's created. We've got the mysql demo config, and you can see the data here, port 3306. Okay, so now if we look at containers getting created, okay, let's kubectl delete pod. Let's see if it has picked up now. kubectl describe pod busybox. Failed mounting, so I don't think it's gonna work, so let me delete it. kubectl delete pod busybox. Okay, pod is deleted. Let me redeploy it. kubectl create -f mysql volume.yaml kubectl get pods. Okay, so now it's running. kubectl exec. Let's get into the container and look at my data. So there is my.cnf. If I do cat my data my.cnf, you can see the MySQL configuration file here. Okay, let's do one verification. If I just edit the same file and update the config map, say for example, if I change the port from 3306 to 8888 and deploy it, kubectl, you can't use create -f because it's already created. You have to use apply. Okay, that's done. kubectl get config map MySQL demo. Did we change that to okay MySQL? Oh, kubectl apply. I didn't apply the config map. I did the apply to the pod specification. Okay, so let's take a look at the YAML file. We've changed that to 8888. kubectl get config maps MySQL demo config. kubectl apply -f. Okay, so now it should have been applied. kubectl get config map. Okay, so it's updated 8888. Let's see whether it has updated inside the container. So we are inside the container and take a look at grep my data my.cnf. I always do this. Grep port 8888. Okay, this time it has updated really quickly. So that's how you use a config map. Okay, I'm gonna clean up the environment. kubectl get all. So as I'm running micro k8s cluster, what I can simply do is micro k8s dot reset. So that's gonna delete all the resources that I have deployed. It's gonna shut down the cluster and bring up the cluster, but I will do that later. And I think that's it I wanted to show you guys in this video. I hope it was useful to you guys and you learned something new today. If you've got any problem following this tutorial, or if anything is not working for you the way I explained in this video, please drop me a comment and I should be able to respond to you. And if you like this video, please click the like button and please share it with your friends. And if you want to get notified about my future videos, please subscribe to my channel, and you can click the bell button so that you can get notified whenever I update add my new videos. Okay, cool. And thank you so much for watching my video today, and I hope you learn Kubernetes very well, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye bye.